detained children, restricted outside communications. Those were some of the findings of a recent investigation by the Red Cross into detention conditions for immigrant detainees. Not in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, in Canada. Inspectors with the Red Cross made 63 visits to facilities in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, coming up with 28 recommendations to address various problems they described as protection gaps. Syed Hussan was not surprised with what the Red Cross found. Mr. Hassan is an organizer with the advocacy group No One is Illegal Toronto and the End Immigration Detention Network. We reached him in Toronto.
Mr. Hassan, for you, what are the most troubling findings in this Red Cross report?
The most troubling finding is that the provincial jails, where a third of all immigration detainees are being held, have absolutely no support systems for immigration holds. So that means people don't have access to legal counsel, they don't have access to phones to call their families, phone cards to call their families abroad, and even the most basic of spiritual services are absent. It's just deplorable how badly immigration detainees are being treated.
And who are these people? Who are the immigrants who are in these facilities?
I mean, I think that is the clearest question we need to ask is why are immigrants being held without trial or charge? These are mostly undocumented people, so people who've been here without status who are being held, but there are also people who are being held right when they arrive. So there are refugee claimants who are detained right at the border. And one of the primary reasons that the immigration enforcement gives for holding them is that they might be flight risks. But I mean, that's something the UN has already said is not sufficient grounds to hold people. Not only that, there's actually no systems or mechanisms in place to actually appeal it. And we don't know why some people are held in minimum security prisons and some in maximum security prisons. When we've asked immigration officials to explain what process somebody ends up in, a 21-hour lockdown versus a minimum security prison, they actually have no system at all. It's on the whim of the officer.
These are not people then who have committed any crimes.
These people might have had criminal sentences, so they may have done their criminal sentences, but that's not what they're in jail for. They're in jail while Canada tries to deport them. However, there are people who've been in jail for up to 10 years. We work with people who've been in detention for 8 and 10 years, and the government is refusing to release them, even though it cannot deport them. So it's not about criminal sentences. It's detention pending deportation in most cases. However, this is actually a punitive, vicious, cruel punishment that's separating people from their friends and families. People are in restraints. The Red Cross report talks about severe mental health impacts. It talks about the detention of children. So it's quite vicious.
People often arrive as families. So what happens when a family, mother, father, children arrive and they must be taken into custody?
I think so. First of all, the CBSA last year detained over 205 children, but at that time it said that many of these children, it wasn't counting because they were actually Canadian citizens. So they were accompanying their parents, so they weren't in detention. So the number could be twice or even 3 times as high. And when asked, they said, at least in one case, the immigration officer said, we're not holding this 7-month-old baby. It can crawl out on the street and call a taxi. So
no, did someone? Is that serious? That was something that was
that
actually
seriously
stated?
Something that was said in a detention review by counsel. I mean, this is the kind of sort of vicious approach that the immigration enforcement takes to immigration detainees. People don't realize that this is a policing agency without oversight. There's enormous injustices where people are being locked away in prisons without trial and without charge.
Where are these people being held? Are these in immigration detention centers or what? What does the Red Cross say where they're being held?
Right. So under this government, about 85,000 people have been detained. So last year there were about 7,000 to 8,000 people who were detained. A third of them are held in provincial prisons. And the other 2/3 are held in immigration holding centers, which are minimum security facilities. There are only immigration holding centers in Ontario, in Quebec, and in British Columbia, and in the rest of the country, everybody just goes to provincial prisons. But most of the provincial prisoners are actually in Ontario, and since September of 2013, so about a year now, 200 immigrants have been on strike against their detention in a maximum security prison here.
In a maximum security prison?
Yes, so anyone who's in a provincial jail is kept in a maximum security prison. So, I mean, imagine this. If you need to do any immigration legal application, you need fingerprints, you need photographs, you need to get online, print off materials. You can't do any of that. So once you're in prison, your chances of actually being able to regularize your stay or even appealing your detention are slim to none. And we actually published an expose showing political meddling, signs of political meddling in the judicial review process by which people are supposed to be able to get out once they're in detention. But if you're in detention, you've been there past 6 months, you're going to be staying there for a very long time.
What are the conditions in which they're being held?
So in a provincial prison, people are being held. So it's a jail cell. So it's about 5 by 10 feet. There are two detainees usually. Sometimes there might be three. People are in orange jumpsuits. If they're in maximum security prison, that means they're in that cell for 21 hours a day. They're even fed inside their cells. And so they are allowed out of those cells into sort of a broader room, which is also still covered, still behind bars. And then every other day, sometimes once a week, they're allowed 30 minutes into what's called a yard. It's actually a concrete box with a barbed wire roof with nothing, just a concrete box, no equipment, no sporting. It's not like in the movies. And now within it, people are often put on lockdown. So particularly during the summer, there's just a staff shortage. So people might just be kept in prison cells for a very long time. Food quality is really bad. No access to spiritual services, no access to education. Families can't visit, 20-minute phone calls. And people are often put in restraints. They're moved from prison to prison constantly. It's quite terrible. I mean, it's time for something to change.
All right, we will leave it there. We will be following the story. Mr. Hussain, thank you.
Thank you for having me.